The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Royal Guard Thomas Mitchell began his usual rounds through the private quarters. After 20 years of loyal service, he knew every corner of the ancient building, every creak of the wooden floors, and every sound that belonged or didn't belong in the sacred halls of the monarchy. Thomas had always been proud of his position. He wore his red uniform with honor and carried himself with the dignity befitting someone trusted with the safety of the royal family. His colleagues respected him, and the royal staff knew him as a man of few words but absolute integrity. He had served through times of celebration and mourning, always maintaining the highest standards of discretion and professionalism. On this particular Tuesday morning, something felt different. The palace seemed unusually quiet, with most of the senior staff attending meetings in the administrative wing. Thomas noticed that several areas that were typically bustling with activity stood empty. The absence of the usual morning chatter among the housekeeping staff created an almost eerie atmosphere in the corridors he patrolled. As he walked through the East Wing, Thomas heard an unusual sound coming from the direction of the Queen's former private study. The late monarch had passed away months ago, and the room had been sealed pending the completion of estate matters. Only a select few individuals had authorized access to this sacred space, and Thomas knew that no official visits were scheduled for today. The sound grew clearer as he approached. It was the distinct noise of someone moving objects, possibly searching through items. Thomas felt his pulse quicken as he realized someone was inside the restricted area, without proper authorization. His training kicked in immediately, and he began to move with the silent precision that had made him one of the palace's most trusted guards. Checking his radio to ensure it was functioning properly, Thomas positioned himself near the doorway to assess the situation. The sounds continued from within, accompanied by what seemed like whispered conversations. He could hear papers rustling and what sounded like boxes being moved around. His years of experience told him this was not normal maintenance or authorized inventory work. Thomas knew he had to be absolutely certain of what he was witnessing before taking any action. False accusations within the royal household could end careers and damage reputations irreparably. He carefully positioned himself where he could observe without being detected, using skills he had developed during his military service before joining the palace guard. The responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders. If someone was indeed accessing the late Queen's personal effects without authorization, it represented not just a security breach, but a profound violation of royal protocol and respect for the deceased monarch. Thomas understood that whatever he discovered in the next few moments would likely change everything. He steadied himself against the wall and prepared to investigate further. The sounds from within the study continued, and Thomas realized he was about to uncover something that would test every aspect of his training, loyalty, and judgment. The palace had always been a place of secrets and careful protocol, but what he was about to witness would challenge everything he thought he knew about the institution he had sworn to protect. Taking a deep breath, Thomas moved closer to the entrance of the sealed study, knowing that the next few minutes would define not only his career, but potentially the future of the royal family itself. The sounds from within grew more distinct, and he began to make out voices he thought he recognized, though he couldn't yet believe what his ears were telling him. The weight of his duty pressed down on him as he prepared to step forward and confront whatever unauthorized activity was taking place in the late Queen's most private sanctuary. Everything he had learned about honor, duty, and loyalty was about to be put to the ultimate test in the corridors of the palace he had sworn to protect. Thomas carefully moved closer to the partially open door of the late Queen's private study, his heart pounding as he tried to process what he was seeing. Through the narrow gap, he could make out two figures moving around the room with obvious familiarity, handling items as if they belonged to them. The shock of recognition hit him like a physical blow when he realized one of the figures was Queen Camilla herself. She was not alone. A man Thomas didn't immediately recognize was with her, carefully examining various items from ornate jewelry boxes and wooden chests that had been opened around the room. The scene looked nothing like an official inventory or authorized inspection. Instead, it appeared to be a private and secretive examination of the late Queen's most personal possessions. Thomas watched in stunned silence as Camilla held up what appeared to be an antique necklace, studying it closely in the light from the tall windows. She spoke quietly to her companion, though Thomas couldn't make out the exact words from his position. The man nodded and began placing several items into a leather bag he had brought with him. The gravity of what he was witnessing began to sink in. These were not just any possessions. These were treasures that had belonged personally to the late Queen Elizabeth, items that held both monetary and sentimental value beyond measure. Many of these pieces had been in the royal family for generations, passed down through centuries of monarchy and representing the very foundation of British royal heritage. Thomas felt torn between his duty to report what he was seeing and his disbelief that such a scene could be unfolding before his eyes. He had always maintained deep respect for the royal family, and the idea that Queen Camilla could be involved in something questionable seemed almost impossible to accept. Yet the evidence was right in front of him, undeniable and shocking. As he continued to observe, Thomas noticed that Camilla and her companion were being very selective about which items they were examining. They seemed to be looking for specific pieces, consulting what appeared to be a written list. This suggested that their presence in the room was not random or impulsive, but rather part of a planned and deliberate operation. The unauthorized man appeared to be some kind of expert, possibly an appraiser or dealer, based on how he handled and examined each piece. He carried a small magnifying glass and seemed to be making notes about certain items. Thomas watched as he photographed several pieces with a professional camera, documenting them from multiple angles. What disturbed Thomas most was the secrecy of the entire operation. If this was legitimate business related to the royal estate, why was it being conducted in such a clandestine manner? Why were no other palace officials present? Why had this meeting not appeared on any official schedule that Thomas was aware of? The questions multiplied in his mind as he continued to witness the strange scene. He began to wonder how long this had been going on, and whether this was the first such meeting or one of many. The comfortable way both individuals moved around the room suggested they had been there before and were familiar with the layout and contents. Thomas realized he was facing the most challenging situation of his entire career. His loyalty to the crown was absolute. But what did loyalty mean when witnessing actions that seemed to violate the very principles the monarchy was supposed to represent? How could he reconcile his duty to protect the royal family with his obligation to ensure that the late Queen's legacy was treated with the respect it deserved? As he struggled with these thoughts, Thomas noticed that Camilla had picked up what appeared to be a particularly valuable tiara, one he remembered seeing in official portraits of the late Queen. The sight of this precious artifact being handled in such an unofficial manner made his decision for him. Whatever the consequences, he knew he could not simply walk away and pretend he had seen nothing. Steeling himself for what was to come, Thomas prepared to step forward and announce his presence, knowing that the next few moments would change everything for everyone involved, including himself. Thomas took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway, clearing his throat to announce his presence. "Your Majesty," he said in his most professional voice, though he could hear a slight tremor despite his years of training. The sound of his voice cut through the quiet of the room like a knife, causing both figures to freeze instantly. Camilla spun around, her face showing a mixture of surprise and something Thomas couldn't quite identify. The tiara she had been examining remained in her hands, catching the morning light and seeming to sparkle accusingly in the sudden tension of the moment. Her companion, a middle-aged man with graying hair and expensive clothing, immediately moved to close the leather bag he had been filling with various items. "Thomas," Camilla said, quickly regaining her composure, though her voice carried a note of strain. "I wasn't expecting anyone to be making rounds in this section today." She carefully placed the tiara back in its case, but not before Thomas had gotten a clear view of it and several other valuable pieces that were scattered across the late Queen's private desk. The guard stood his ground, his training taking over even as his mind raced to process the surreal situation. "Your Majesty, I must ask about the nature of your visit to this sealed area. My records show no authorized access scheduled for today, and I was not informed of any official business taking place here." The unnamed man stepped forward, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed both friendly and nervous. "I'm David Worthington from Worthington Antiques and Appraisals," he said with a slight accent that Thomas couldn't quite place. "Her Majesty has asked me to conduct a private assessment of certain items for estate planning purposes." Thomas nodded politely but remained focused on his duty. "I understand, sir, but all access to this room requires advance authorization through the proper security channels." This is standard protocol for any activities involving the late Queen's personal effects. He kept his voice steady and professional, though inside he was struggling with the implications of what he had witnessed. Camilla moved closer to Thomas, her expression becoming more serious. Thomas, I appreciate your dedication to protocol, but surely you understand that as Queen, I have certain privileges and responsibilities that sometimes require flexibility in these matters. The assessment Mr. Worthington is conducting is entirely legitimate and necessary for proper estate management. The guard felt the weight of her words and the obvious authority behind them, but his training and conscience would not allow him to simply accept the explanation without question. Your Majesty, I certainly respect your position and authority. However, my oath requires me to follow established security procedures regardless of who is involved. Perhaps we could contact the estate administrator to verify the authorization for this assessment. The tension in the room became palpable. Thomas could see that his suggestion was not being received well, but he knew he could not compromise his principles or abandon his duty, even when facing the Queen herself. The silence stretched uncomfortably as all three individuals seemed to consider their options. Mr. Worthington began gathering his materials, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Perhaps it would be best if we rescheduled this assessment for a time when all proper authorizations can be confirmed, he suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Thomas noticed that several items remained out of their usual places, and the leather bag still appeared to contain objects that hadn't been returned to their proper locations. His observational skills, honed by years of security work, picked up these details automatically, and he found himself mentally cataloging everything he had seen. Your Majesty, Thomas said carefully, I would be happy to escort you and Mr. Worthington to the security office where we can quickly resolve any authorization questions. I'm certain this is simply a matter of paperwork that can be sorted out promptly. He spoke with respect but firmness, making it clear that he was not going to simply walk away from the situation. Camilla's expression hardened slightly, and Thomas could see that she was calculating her options. The room remained filled with tension as all three people stood surrounded by the scattered treasures of the late Queen, each knowing that whatever happened next would have consequences far beyond this single moment. The guard waited for a response, knowing that his career and possibly much more hung in the balance, but absolutely certain that he could not abandon his duty to protect the integrity of the royal household, regardless of the personal cost. The standoff in the late Queen's study continued for what felt like an eternity, though in reality only minutes had passed. Thomas maintained his position near the doorway, professionally alert but internally struggling with a situation unlike anything he had encountered in his 2 decades of royal service. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed to illuminate every detail of the scene with uncomfortable clarity. Camilla finally broke the silence, her voice taking on a tone that Thomas had never heard before, one that seemed to blend authority with something approaching desperation. Thomas, you have always been a loyal servant to this family. Surely you can understand that there are matters of royal business that sometimes require discretion and cannot always follow standard bureaucratic procedures. The guard felt the weight of her words but also sensed something troubling in her demeanor. His years of training had taught him to read people and situations, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that something was fundamentally wrong with the explanation he was being given. The presence of the appraiser, the secretive nature of the meeting, and the obvious selection of valuable items all pointed to something beyond routine estate management. Mr. Worthington seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the prolonged confrontation. He began placing items back in their cases with obvious haste, though Thomas noticed he seemed reluctant to empty the leather bag completely. Several pieces remained inside, and the appraiser kept glancing toward the door as if calculating his chances of leaving quickly. Your Majesty, Thomas said carefully, my loyalty to the royal family is exactly why I cannot ignore proper protocols. The late Queen's possessions represent not just personal items, but historical artifacts that belong to the Crown, and ultimately to the British people. Any decisions regarding these items must be made through proper channels to ensure transparency and accountability. The words seemed to strike a nerve with Camilla, whose composure began to show cracks for the first time. Are you questioning my authority as Queen? Are you suggesting that I don't have the right to manage royal property as I see fit? Her voice rose slightly, and Thomas could see that the situation was escalating beyond what anyone had anticipated. Thomas remained calm but firm in his response. Your Majesty, I would never question your authority within its proper bounds. However, my understanding is that the late Queen's personal effects are subject to estate procedures that involve multiple parties, including legal representatives and estate administrators. I believe any significant decisions regarding these items should be documented through official channels. The tension in the room reached a breaking point when Mr. Worthington suddenly moved toward the door, still carrying the leather bag. Perhaps I should leave and allow you to sort this out privately, he said. But Thomas smoothly stepped into his path, blocking the exit without appearing threatening. I'm afraid I'll need to ask you to remain until we can clarify the situation, sir, Thomas said politely but firmly. Standard procedure requires that all visitors to restricted areas be properly logged out through security protocols. He could see the appraiser's growing panic and knew that allowing him to leave with the bag would compromise any possibility of understanding what had really been taking place. Camilla moved closer to Thomas, and he could see genuine concern in her eyes for the first time. Thomas, you're putting me in an impossible position. There are aspects of royal business that you simply cannot understand from your position. Sometimes decisions must be made quickly and quietly for the good of the monarchy itself. The guard felt a moment of doubt as he considered her words, but his training and principles held firm. Your Majesty, if this is legitimate royal business, then proper documentation will only serve to protect you and validate your actions. I'm simply asking that we follow the procedures that exist to protect everyone involved, including yourself. As the conversation continued, Thomas began to notice more details about the items that had been selected. They were all extremely valuable pieces, many of which he remembered seeing in official photographs and state occasions. More importantly, they were all items that could be easily transported and would be difficult to trace if they disappeared from the royal collection. The realization that he might be witnessing something far more serious than unauthorized estate management began to dawn on Thomas. His duty as a royal guard suddenly felt more important than ever, and he knew that whatever the consequences, he could not allow this situation to continue without proper oversight and documentation. Thomas reached for his radio, knowing that he needed to contact his supervisor immediately. The situation had moved far beyond what he could handle alone, and proper protocol demanded that senior security personnel be notified of any irregularities involving royal family members. As his hand moved toward the communication device, Camilla's expression changed dramatically. Wait, she said sharply, her voice carrying a tone of command that made Thomas pause. Before you make any calls that could create unnecessary complications, let me explain something that might change your perspective on this situation. She moved closer to the desk where many of the late Queen's treasures remained displayed, her fingers trailing across the surface of an ornate jewelry box. Mr. Worthington looked increasingly desperate and began moving toward the windows, apparently hoping to find another way out of the room. His behavior was becoming more suspicious by the minute, and Thomas made a mental note to ensure that palace security would need to conduct a thorough investigation of his background and credentials. The truth is, Thomas, Camilla continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, there are financial pressures facing the royal family that the public simply cannot know about. Certain expenses related to maintaining the monarchy have grown beyond what our official budgets can support. Some of these items represent assets that could help address these challenges discreetly. Thomas felt his stomach drop as he began to understand the full implications of what he was hearing. The Queen was essentially admitting to planning to sell royal treasures to cover financial difficulties, and she was doing it in secret through a private appraiser. The gravity of the situation hit him like a physical blow as he realized he was witnessing potential fraud against the Crown estate. Your Majesty, he said slowly, his voice barely steady. Are you saying that you're planning to sell items from the royal collection without proper authorization from the Crown estate authorities? He knew the answer even as he asked the question, but he needed to hear it confirmed to fully understand what he was dealing with. Camilla's composure finally cracked completely, and Thomas could see desperation in her eyes. You don't understand the pressures I'm under. The expenses of royal life, the expectations, the constant scrutiny. Sometimes unconventional solutions are necessary. These items have been sitting in storage for months. No one would miss a few pieces, especially if it helps preserve the stability of the monarchy itself. Thomas realized that he was hearing a confession to what amounted to theft of national treasures. His mind raced as he tried to process the enormity of what was happening. The woman he had sworn to protect was revealing herself to be involved in criminal activity, and his duty as both a guard and a citizen was crystal clear, regardless of her royal status. Mr. Worthington, apparently realizing that the situation was spiraling out of control, suddenly made a break for the door. Thomas, despite being caught off guard by the full implications of what Camilla had revealed, reacted instantly with his trained reflexes. He intercepted the appraiser just as the man reached the threshold, firmly but carefully restraining him. "I'm afraid no one can leave until this matter is properly resolved," Thomas said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his position. He could feel the leather bag in Worthington's hand, heavy with what he now knew were stolen royal treasures, and the reality of stopping an active crime in progress strengthened his resolve. Camilla watched in horror as her carefully planned scheme began to collapse around her. "Thomas, please," she pleaded. "You have to understand that I never intended for things to go this far. The pressures of royal life, the financial demands. I was just trying to find a solution that wouldn't embarrass the family publicly." Thomas felt genuinely sorry for her obvious distress, but his oath and his conscience left him no choice. "Your Majesty, I understand that you may have been under pressure, but there are proper channels for addressing financial concerns within the royal household. What I've witnessed here today represents a serious breach of trust and potentially criminal activity that I cannot ignore." The room fell silent except for the sound of Mr. Worthington's labored breathing as he stood, restrained near the doorway. Thomas knew that the next few minutes would determine not just his own future, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. He reached for his radio again, this time with complete determination to do his duty regardless of the consequences. Thomas activated his radio and spoke in clear professional tones that echoed through the ornate study. "Security control. This is Guard Mitchell in the East Wing. I need immediate assistance from senior security and request that Captain Harrison respond to the late Queen's private study immediately. We have a Code 7 situation requiring senior management intervention." The response came quickly through the radio. "Copy that, Guard Mitchell.
Captain Harrison and senior security are en route.
Estimated arrival in 3 minutes. Please maintain current position and ensure scene security." As they waited for backup to arrive, Thomas could see Camilla's face cycle through a range of emotions, from anger to desperation to what appeared to be resignation. Mr. Worthington had stopped struggling and now stood quietly, though his eyes darted constantly between Thomas and the various exits from the room. "Thomas," Camilla said quietly, "you realize that what you're doing will destroy everything. The scandal alone will damage the monarchy beyond repair. Is following protocol really worth bringing down an institution that has served Britain for over 1,000 years?" The guard felt the weight of her words deeply, but his response came from 20 years of unwavering service and integrity. "Your Majesty, with respect, the monarchy's strength has always come from the trust of the British people. The trust can only be maintained through transparency and adherence to the law. If the institution cannot survive the truth, then perhaps it needs to be reformed rather than protected through deception." Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor outside as Captain Harrison arrived with 2 additional security officers. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as he prepared to transfer responsibility for the situation to his superiors. He knew that once he made his report, events would move beyond his control and into the hands of people who would have to make decisions about the future of the royal family. Captain Harrison entered the room, his experienced eyes immediately taking in the scene: the scattered treasures, the defensive posture of Queen Camilla, the restrained appraiser, and Thomas standing firm in his duty despite the obvious personal cost. "Guard Mitchell, please provide a brief summary of the situation." Thomas straightened and delivered his report in crisp, professional language, detailing everything he had observed and heard. He spoke without emotion or judgment, simply stating the facts as he had witnessed them. When he mentioned Camilla's admission about financial pressures and unauthorized sale of royal treasures, he could see Captain Harrison's expression grow increasingly grave. "Your Majesty," Captain Harrison said with careful respect, "I'm afraid this matter is now beyond palace security's ability to handle internally. The items involved are part of the Crown estate, and any unauthorized removal constitutes a serious legal matter that must be reported to the appropriate authorities. Camilla's last vestiges of composure crumbled. "This is madness. I am the Queen of England. Surely we can resolve this matter privately without destroying everything my family has worked to build." Her voice rose to nearly a shout, and Thomas could see the true desperation of someone who realized their world was collapsing around them. Mr. Worthington finally spoke up, his voice shaky with fear. "I want to make it clear that I had no idea this was unauthorized. Her Majesty told me she had full authority to commission this appraisal. I've never been involved in anything improper in 30 years of business." Captain Harrison nodded grimly and began coordinating with his team to secure the scene and document everything that had been disturbed. Thomas watched as crime scene protocols were implemented in the private study of the late Queen Elizabeth. A scene so surreal that he still had difficulty believing it was really happening. As additional security personnel arrived and began the process of documenting evidence, Thomas realized that his actions in the next few hours would likely determine not just the immediate resolution of this crisis, but potentially the future direction of the British monarchy itself. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming, but his conscience remained clear that he had done the right thing. Regardless of the consequences, the palace that had seemed so quiet and peaceful just hours earlier was now buzzing with activity, as senior staff members were quietly summoned to deal with a crisis that none of them could have imagined when they arrived for work that morning. Within hours, the highest levels of British government and royal administration were involved in managing what had rapidly become a constitutional crisis of unprecedented proportions. Thomas found himself in the unprecedented position of being both a key witness and a reluctant hero whose actions had prevented what could have been an even greater scandal if the theft had been discovered later. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of the problem. Financial records showed that Camilla had been under enormous personal financial pressure, much of it stemming from expensive tastes and poor financial management that had never been properly overseen. The pressure to maintain royal appearances while dealing with private debt had apparently driven her to increasingly desperate measures. Mr. Worthington's claims of innocence proved to be partially true. He had indeed been told that the appraisal was authorized, but investigators found evidence that he had been willing to pay cash for items without requiring proper documentation, suggesting he may have suspected the irregular nature of the transactions. His business license was suspended pending a complete investigation of his practices. Thomas was called to testify before a closed parliamentary committee, where his detailed and professional account of the events was praised by officials who recognized that his integrity had likely saved the monarchy from a scandal that could have been far worse if the theft had continued undetected. His testimony was considered so crucial that special security measures were implemented to protect him during the investigation period. The royal family moved quickly to address the crisis, with King Charles taking personal responsibility for the oversight failures that had allowed the situation to develop. Camilla was quietly removed from all official duties pending resolution of the legal proceedings against her, and a complete audit of all royal treasures and assets was ordered to determine if any other items had been compromised. Public reaction, when the story inevitably leaked to the media, was explosive. Anti-monarchy groups used the scandal as evidence that the royal system was fundamentally corrupt, while monarchy supporters argued that the swift action taken once the problem was discovered proved that the institution could police itself effectively. Polls showed dramatic swings in public opinion about the future of the royal family. Thomas, despite being offered substantial sums by tabloid newspapers for exclusive interviews, maintained his silence and dignity throughout the media frenzy. His actions were praised by government officials and royal supporters as an example of how personal integrity and duty could triumph over personal loyalty when the two came into conflict. The legal proceedings against Camilla were handled with unprecedented discretion, but ultimately resulted in her agreeing to full restitution of any items taken and acceptance of permanent removal from any official royal duties. The monarchy survived the crisis, but with significant reforms implemented to prevent similar situations in the future, including independent oversight of all royal finances and assets. 6 months later, Thomas was quietly promoted and given a commendation for his service, though he never spoke publicly about the events. He continued his duties with the same professionalism and integrity he had always shown, but colleagues noted that he seemed to carry himself with even greater confidence, knowing that when tested under the most difficult circumstances possible, he had chosen duty over convenience. The late Queen's study was eventually restored and reopened as a memorial, with enhanced security measures and strict protocols governing access. Many of the treasures that had been at risk were put on public display for the first time, allowing the British people to see artifacts that might have been lost forever if not for the actions of one guard who understood that true loyalty sometimes requires difficult choices. The palace itself seemed to carry a different atmosphere after the crisis, with staff members displaying a renewed commitment to the principles of service and integrity that had always been supposed to guide royal operations. Thomas's actions had demonstrated that these principles were not just words, but living values that could triumph even in the most challenging circumstances when upheld by people of character and conviction.